Lester, Wushu engineer. The Wushu scientist and I have always wanted to set up an isometric training gym within our martial arts school, and have recently begun constructing some simple isometric training equipment. I thought it would be a good topic to share on my channel with my audience, because there may be a few of you out there who would like to do the same, but who don't want to break the bank, especially not in these trying times. First of all, what is isometric training? Wikipedia defines isometric training as follows. An isometric exercise is a form of exercise involving the static contraction of a muscle without any visible movement in the angle of the joint. The term isometric combines the Greek words isos, equal, and metria, measuring, meaning that in these exercises the length of the muscle and the angle of the joint do not change, although contraction strength may be varied. This is in contrast to isotonic contractions, in which the contraction strength does not change, though the muscle length and joint angle do. The three main types of isometric exercise are isometric presses, pulls, and holds. They may be included in a strength training regime in order to improve the body's ability to apply power from a static position, or in the case of isometric holds, improve the body's ability to maintain a position for a period of time. Considered as an action, isometric presses are also of fundamental importance to the body's ability to prepare itself to perform immediately subsequent power movements. Such preparation is also known as isometric preload. Traditional martial arts training involves a significant amount of isometric training, along with hybrid training methods that incorporate both isometric and isotonic exercises. Examples of isometric exercises used in traditional martial arts include prolonged static stance training, holding various pushes and pulls, such as in the traditional pushing mountains exercise, and hybrid isometric isotonic movements such as slow qigong and tai chi movements. Isometric training can help in training muscles to exert force when little or no movement is involved, such as in grapples, locks, holds, and strikes that must be performed with little or no space for acceleration to occur, such as in a 1-inch or 0-inch punch, or for instance, rapid, explosive joint manipulations designed to cause brutal damage instead of just acting as joint controls. As mentioned in the Wikipedia article, isometric training can assist in improving explosive power by improving an athlete's ability to perform isometric preloading just before an explosive movement. Wikipedia elaborates as follows. The isometric preloading of muscles is instinctively performed in order to generate power to be used in subsequent dynamic movements. A fundamental element of this muscular preloading is the performance of an isometric press action. An everyday example is a person getting off a chair. They first raise their posterior off the chair and then perform a pressing action downwards on their bent legs. As the bent legs resist the downward force upon them in equal measure, an isometric press is generated. From this point, the person then straightens and stands up. A more dynamic example is a vertical jump. Here, the jumper crouches down and adopts a similar isometric press before powering upwards into the jump. The employment of isometric presses in order to aid explosive power movements is also found in sports such as boxing. Here, the boxer may bend their lead leg while positioning the torso and their respective body weight over it, so there exists equal forces between the upward force of the bent leg and the downward force of the torso. The boxer then throws a lead hook from this position, and the forces from the isometric press are channeled into the punch and help to increase its overall power. Such a channeling of force fundamentally represents the purpose of an isometric preload, which is a preparatory action to aid a subsequent power movement. More specific examples from traditional martial arts include adopting a low stance prior to an explosive, stable translational movement, or creating the hollowed Han Shen structure by manipulating pressure levels in the intra-abdominal cavities just prior to delivering a punch. Although isotonic forms of training are far more familiar to people in general, so pretty much everyone understands the isotonic movements seen by people working out in the gym, isometric training does form part of many successful athletic and physical training programs because of the benefits that it brings. However, one of the problems associated with some types of isometric training is the lack of adequate feedback for the athlete. If you think about someone, for instance, training with free weights in the gym, the feedback that they receive from that training is that they can easily monitor their progression over time with the incremental increases in weight that they are able to lift. So it's easier to address this feedback with isotonic training, in particular with structured and incremental weight training, but it's also easier to address this in certain types of isometric holds and against known weights, such as holding known weights at specific heights, or in low horse training, for instance. In these instances, the resistance remains the same, either body weight or the weight that's being held in position, but the duration can be timed to record progress, a type of time-based feedback, if you like. In other words, if I hold my low stance for 5 minutes on day 1 and extend this to 6 minutes on day 2 for argument's sake, I can thus monitor my progress. I increased by 1 minute. On the other hand, if I was to perform a simple isometric press with one hand against my other hand, like so, I have no real way of knowing how much force I'm exerting outside of my own sensation of the level of exertion I'm experiencing. And those of you who have a few decades of experience in physical training under their belts may agree with me when I say that human performance and the perception of effort changes from one day to another. In other words, what may seem to me like maximum effort on one day may only represent 70% effort on another day, for argument's sake. This leads to significant variation in the amount of sustained force exerted in certain types of isometric training. This variability and inconsistency is not conducive to overall improvement over time, or to a structured program of incremental improvement. Another problem associated with the lack of feedback in certain types of isometric exercises is similar in some ways to the concept of homeostasis. So, Wikipedia defines homeostasis as follows. In biology, homeostasis is the state of steady internal physical and chemical conditions maintained by living systems. This is the condition of optimal functioning for the organism and includes many variables such as body temperature and fluid balance being kept within certain preset limits, the homeostatic range. Now, in terms of physical training, both psychologically and physically, human beings naturally seek to establish balance and economy, and seek to avoid challenges and extremes. A form of training homeostasis, if you like. Of course, as we all know, being challenged is extremely important to stimulate the body and the mind to grow and develop in order to rise to the challenge. And yet our natural inclination physically, emotionally and psychologically is to avoid challenging ourselves. So, in other words, unless I have some kind of feedback system, feedback loop, that keeps me honest and helps me monitor my progress, I will likely default to reducing the intensity and challenge of an exercise over time. So in some isometric exercises, both natural performance variability and my inherent tendency to reduce the challenge of an exercise may combine to reduce the benefit that the exercise can bring to me over time. This touches actually on a wider need for accurate and usable measuring and monitoring of key performance indicators, or KPIs, in martial arts and combat systems. The measurement and monitoring of KPIs is well used in other sports and physical disciplines to assist athletes in improving their performances over time. And yet there are not that many facilities that offer the same kind of specialist services to martial artists and combat athletes. This is one of the factors that inspired us to launch the Martial Arts Research and Testing Laboratory, or MARTEL. But that's another story. Now, how could we measure the force exerted in isometric actions? The Wikipedia article goes on to mention 3 different methods of measuring the force exerted by isometric actions, using force measurement plates or load cells, dynamometers, which are devices with handles that can get pushed, pulled, or squeezed together. Most people are familiar with the hand dynamometer used to actually measure hand grip strength. And then the third method that Wikipedia mentions is the use of electromyography. Electromyograph measures muscle activation levels through the use of electrodes, which are either placed on the muscle in the form of pads or inserted into the muscle in the form of needles. So, load cells can be used to provide direct force feedback for most types of isometric training. Problem solved, right? Well, load cells can be expensive, so the problem becomes financial. Forking out the few $1,000s that it would be required for each load cell makes having multiple pieces of equipment impossible for most people. Most folk, ourselves included, just don't have the 10 to 20,000 that would be necessary to set up a reasonable number of feedback-based isometric training stations lying around in our wallets gathering dust. However, I have a solution for those who are interested. A little while ago, we ordered some of these mini digital crane scales. In fact, they were cheap enough, and we ended up ordering 6 of them at roughly $25 each. They certainly beat full load cells on the cost point. They're actually simple strain link load cells that provide a digital numerical output to an LCD screen showing the amount of pulling force applied to the load cell element in kilograms. These units contain an S-link load cell spring element constructed of aluminium with embedded strain gauge sensors that provides an output that's converted to a digital weight measurement by a small digital processing circuit. And this is what the device looks like. So this is an example of these are the units that we got hold of. I've grayed out blanked out the manufacturer's details because we're not selling these or anything, so I don't necessarily want to advertise for them. But this is what the unit looks like as it comes. As you can see, these are the attachment points to the load cell spring element with a display, battery compartment in the back, etc. And a couple of an attachment hook and a shackle. Their purpose is as a weighing tool that's connected to a chain of a small crane. We ordered versions of the mini digital crane scale that could handle up to 500 kilograms. In pretty much all cases of their use in isometric exercises, the expected maximum force exerted when converted to kilograms will be much, much lower than this. But in fact, the resolution of these little digital crane scales is actually pretty darn good at around 100 grams. More than accurate enough for the purposes. Unfortunately, because they're designed as pull force sensors, they need to be deployed in that way. They can't just be connected to a force plate and used as our lodestar sensor is used, for instance. In addition, they're not designed for impact-based movement. Now, most human movement will be too slow to cause damage to the device, so this is not typically going to present an issue. However, the user will most likely not be able to read the LCD digital readout fast enough to get their impact-based value. So these devices are best used to measure sustained forces, which is perfect for most isometric exercises. In addition, these particular scales do not come with a function that records the maximum force registered during a movement. They can be set to lock onto a stable reading once the oscillations die down after a period of a few seconds. However, maximal human force is typically too variable, jerky, and noisy for the device to lock onto. In addition, it requires holding the maximal force stable and steady for a prolonged period before the device locks on. As such, this function is not particularly useful for our purposes. My solution to the problem was to extract the load cell spring element and extend the 4 wires connecting it to the housing, which contains the batteries, processor, and LCD display. using a simple data cable soldered to the appropriate terminals. This would allow the display to be mounted remotely from the load cell spring element, enabling the user to see their values on the display, remember them, and record their maximums after the exercises are complete. I then wrapped the load cell spring element in heat shrink to protect the wiring and connections during use. And what I've done is just removed the load cell spring element and put an extension lead, an extension communications lead in, so that it can be used remotely. Okay. This was a very simple operation for anyone to perform. All that's required is some knowledge of basic electronics, soldering, and some basic tools such as screwdrivers, wire cutters, and a soldering iron. This made these units usable as feedback systems, which could, with a little bit of creativity, be used for most types of isometric pushes and pulls. I converted 3 of the mini crane scales and set them up in 3 different stations. One of the stations is a linear standing lift arrangement, which will predominantly be used as a mid-thigh isometric pull station, although it can equally well be used as a basic standing lift from any height, from floor level through strict arm curl, arms bent at 90 degrees, all the way up to a full extension overhead lift. The second arrangement that I built out of it was a basic bench-mounted arrangement that would typically be used for bench press style pushes at various bar heights, but could be used in a seated curl position or a seated overhead lift position amongst other positions. The sky's the limit, really. And then the third station that I built was a pillar-mounted pull arrangement that could be used to train isometric preloading for rapid movement or balanced pulls and pushes from low stances. In our case, we try to avoid leaning body weight into these kinds of movements to avoid unbalanced movement and uncontrolled collision with an opponent. So this arrangement allows for centeredness and balance to be trained while generating maximum force. I asked the Wushu scientists to demonstrate these 3 stations for the video, and this is what these stations look like in use. So this is one of the stations. I'll just do a walk around and show the 3 stations that I built for the isometric training gym, isometric training stations. This is one of them. You can see the remote display there, and this is the deadlift slash linear lift arrangement. So you can adjust the length of that chain to really do any kind of isometric pull that you want, all the way up to overhead lift. And this is the second station, which is a bench press style seated lift station. There's the display. You can see I've got a bit of a yoke that is attached to the load cell spring element underneath, which in turn is attached to a bar via chains. And to use it, you'll either be sitting or lying or kneeling or whatever on the bench and performing your isometric pull or hold or lift. And finally, got a rope-based pillar pull style arrangement. There's the load cell spring element. I've just got it connected to a clamp on the pillar so that it's easy to remove the whole assembly. Of course, this equipment has to be able to pack away, and that's one of the beauties of it. And there is the display. I've got it connected to a rope, so any kind of rope pull or anything you can think of really to do with a rope pull. In our case, we're probably going to be mostly using it for pulls and perhaps even pushes from various stances. So just adjusting where your where you're going to be pulling on the rope. You can be essentially pushing the rope to the side away from the load cell spring element if you wish. So we'll head back to the first station, and the Wushu scientist is going to give it a go. So just be switching on the display there, and we're just using we're not using wrist wraps or anything on it at the moment, so this is just a pull just to demonstrate how the equipment works. Okay, so, and go. And okay, I was unfortunately we had the light shining on the display there, so we might have to try that again. Sorry.
That's all right. So just give me a minute.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
And pull, 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 pull. And we went up to 150.
We're slightly lower.
Slightly lower. Okay, that's all right. It's just to demonstrate how the equipment is working, how it works. So that's that. Of course, that displays in kilograms. And we'll go to the next station now that you're all warmed up.
Alrighty.
So switch the display on. And so just get ready. Just lift up. Just make sure that it locks in. Yeah, it locks in. Okay. And actually, let me just switch this off because it's on the hold bit.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
Is it ready?
Let's just switch off and switch on again. Okay, and go. Okay, there we go. All right, so we've got it set at just an arbitrary height at the moment, sort of a midway point in the lift. But yeah, that can be changed. So we could actually do that as a seated curl style lift, or even a seated overhead lift if we get longer chains for that. So that's just an idea of how it can be used. And we'll go to the pillar mounted rope pull, and she's going to go into the Wushu scientist is going to go into a low stance, and she's going to ensure that she's not going to be leaning into it. So the goal is not to lean or throw your body weight backward to, in our case, to get maximum force, but to actually try and do a stable pull against the load cell. So let me just get a good angle here because I'm getting a lot of reflections. It might actually come from the other side. Okay, when you're ready. Okay, good. 25, good. Okay.
That's harder than it looks, that one.
There we go. Professional opinion. Harder than it looks. So yeah, so that's just another example of how these little load cells can be used to set up a simple isometric training gym. As you can see, the setups are fairly simple, but work surprisingly well for their purpose. I still have 3 more of these mini crane scales to play around with. I have some ideas for some more Wushu specific isometric training stations. One idea that I'd like to try is incorporating one of these into a simple one-armed training dummy, a rigid dummy, to enable the use of the dummy to get some kind of force feedback values for various China style manipulations, locks and holds performed against the dummy's arm. However, I thought it would be interesting to see if any of you, my viewers, have some suggestions or arrangements that you would like to see attempted. Or perhaps you have a specific type of isometric movement that you would like to see me develop a training arrangement for, using one of the crane scales as a feedback element. Let me know in the comment section below. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope it's a benefit to you, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers!